were never a god. You were never even a man.
This is awesome.
Zack Snyder has a very particular style as a filmmaker, not just in terms of the way he directs a scene with a lot of slow motion, stylized visuals, and licensed music, but also in terms of the types of stories that he tells. His movies generally tend to have a very dark, very edgy, and very moody tone and atmosphere, and they generally involve a lot of violence, sex, and just overall lean more towards a relatively older audience.
Do you bleed?
Some people think he's an innovative auteur, others see him as a pretentious style over substance hack, but he's definitely got his own artistic identity whether you care for it or not. Personally, I really like most of his movies. I think that he has a really bold and innovative style of storytelling, and his directing does a great job of making those stories feel big and epic. I admit that there are valid reasons to criticize him though, so feel free to leave your own opinions about him in the comments. All that being said though, there's one film he's directed that stands out from the others in a few different ways. That film being Legend of the Guardians, The Owls of Ga'Hoole.
You really think the Guardians are out there?
They have to be.
Based on a book series from author Catherine Lasky titled Guardians of Ga'Hoole, which is honestly just a more concise title that the movie made needlessly longer, this movie is kind of an interesting case for Snyder, not just because it's the only animated film he's ever made. I mean, his movies incorporate a lot of CGI, it's not totally unbelievable that he would try to do this, but arguably bigger than that is that this is the only film he's ever made that could kind of be classed as a family film. It's based on a series of children's books, and the film itself is only rated PG, which is very different from Snyder, who will usually go for an R rating anytime a studio will let him. So, I want to take a look at this film and figure out how is Snyder's style affected by this transition to a new target audience, and in general, is the movie any good? The film takes place in a fantasy world populated by animals and protected by the Guardians of Ga'Hoole, legendary owl warriors that years ago saved the world from a group of evil owls named the Pure Ones.
The Guardians were victorious. The Owl Kingdoms were free once more.
One night, two young owl brothers named Soren and Kludd are taken from their home by the Pure Ones, who are forcibly building up a new army to try once again to conquer the world. Soren manages to escape, and with the help of a few other owls he meets along the way, sets out to find the Guardians, help them to defeat the Pure Ones, and rescue his captured brother, unaware that Kludd's allegiance may not be with who he thinks.
Kludd, come on, now's our chance.
Well, what are you waiting for, son? This is your chance to go home.
I am home.
So if we're going to talk about Snyder's transition to a younger audience, one thing that we need to talk about is the tone, because just in terms of the concept, I like what this movie is going for. Compared to the brooding and somber feel of Snyder's other work, Guardians takes a bit of a more magical and optimistic approach. The world of the movie is often very whimsical, with warm colors, a mystical, adventurous musical score, and a backstory of these great heroes whose courage still inspires the world's inhabitants years later.
Your days of terrorizing the Owl Kingdoms are over.
Not so fast. You're no match for my army of evil ones.
The focus on owls as the main characters also allows the film to tell a lot of its own story through these flying scenes that capture the excitement and majesty of soaring through the air and seeing the world from a multitude of different areas and perspectives. They kind of put me in mind of the flying scenes from How to Train Your Dragon now that I think about it. And if I'm comparing your flying scenes to the ones from How to Train Your Dragon, you're definitely doing something right. But at the same time, Snyder doesn't shy away from the darkness that his movies are known for. Zack has gone on record that he doesn't like following the approach that the rest of the industry takes and prefers to just make the art that he wants to make, even if it doesn't resonate with everyone who watches it. And that shines through here because this movie feels very different to other Western animated movies coming out nowadays. As terrific as a lot of them are, one thing that does bother me ever so slightly is that almost all of them, at least to some extent, are comedies. And I'm not saying that to discredit comedy as a genre. I mean, the whole reason I avoid leaning into the whole comedic reviewer shtick is because, quite frankly, I just don't think I'm talented enough to pull it off. But at the same time, I can't help but notice that it's a genre that the animation industry leans into pretty heavily, especially when there are so many other genres that are just begging for some attention. Legend of the Guardians isn't devoid of jokes, but it generally takes its story pretty seriously, and the focus is more on the dire situations that the characters go through.
Together, Gilfie, we'll get away.
I'm cold.
Together.
Another way that this movie stands out from most other modern animated films is the visual style. Instead of the more stylized and exaggerated designs that typically come from movies like this, Guardians instead goes for a slightly more realistic art style with photorealistic textures and character designs that look more like the animals that they're actually supposed to be. And the great thing is that despite the less exaggerated facial features, the characters still managed to convey a lot of emotion, and I never felt like there was a disconnect with what the character was supposed to be feeling and what I'm looking at on screen. What's your excuse, Lion King 2019?
Come on, wake up.
And the environments look just as good with these huge, expansive natural settings and beautiful lighting. To be honest, considering how visually oriented Snyder's movies are, it makes total sense that he would make a fully animated film, and it's surprising that he hasn't done any others before or since. As someone who is generally a fan of Snyder's work, it is really interesting seeing him take on a project like this. In some ways, it's completely different from his usual output, but in other ways, that director credit feels right at home. I respect him for trying a story outside his normal wheelhouse, and even making that story into his own in pretty non-intrusive ways. It gives the movie a bit of a unique feel. It's just a shame that the movie itself isn't very good.
Well, I bet you didn't count on this.
Yeah, as much as I can admire what this movie is going for, when you actually look at the story and characters and all the things that those cool stylistic elements are supposed to enhance, it comes off like a bit of a waste. Soren is a really one-dimensional, wide-eyed hero archetype that you can find in pretty much any other fantasy adventure. I'll admit that I like the opening scene where we hear him passionately recount the tales of the Guardians.
To make strong the weak, mend the broken, and vanquish evil.
But once the plot gets going and he has to start taking things seriously, he doesn't have much in the way of character development to make him particularly interesting. They do try to give him an arc where he's learning to fly and fight to take on the Pure Ones, but we don't really get much of a struggle or character flaw that would make it compelling to watch him learn. And the obligatory ragtag group of heroes that he teams up with don't fare much better. The first one he meets is Gylfi, who basically has no character traits or chemistry with Soren. The only motivation they have for working together is because they have a common enemy, which is fine for when they first meet each other, but I never got the sense that they were bonding or that they were working together for each other's benefit. The other characters that they team up with serve as the comic relief, and pretty much all of them share the same basic personality, that being they're quirky and not much else.
We were just looking for a place to hide and rest.
In which order?
Who are these tiny owls and why are they talking to dinner?
My name is not Dinner.
Well, dinner's rather moody, isn't it?
There are a few other characters, but in order to talk about them, we first need to discuss the war between the Guardians and the Pure Ones. One of the biggest problems with the movie's world building is that the war is never really expanded upon in any meaningful detail. We know that the Pure Ones are power hungry, but we don't know anything about their actual ideology or why they want to conquer the world. Their name, the Pure Ones, suggests that they see themselves as inherently superior to most other inhabitants of this world, but we're not shown any indication of what led them to think that. The Queen of the Pure Ones, named Naira, is just the typical calm and confident villain who barely regards the heroes as a threat. That could work, but we don't see much of the havoc the Pure Ones have brought onto the world that would give context for why we should find her intimidating. Granted, she did kidnap a lot of young owls and force them to work for her, but those are children. It's very rare that we actually see the Pure Ones pick on someone their own size, despite the fact that that would really help show that they're not easily defeated. We also see a few characters that played a role in the war back in the day, which could have potentially added some depth to the history of this world. You know, the movie could flesh out their backstories from the war and show how those events still affect them years later. But much like the other characters we've seen thus far, none of them are given enough emotional weight for it to add to the story. For example, we get an owl named Grimble who is initially working for the Pure Ones until it's revealed that he's only doing it out of coercion.
They took my family. They promised me if I followed orders, no harm had come to them.
But the movie doesn't go into any depth for why we should care about this. It just says, this is a thing that happened, and then moves on.
Well, that lead led nowhere.
Then there's the Guardian named Lies of Keel who defeated the leader of the Pure Ones long ago. Soren has looked up to Lies of Keel his entire life because of the stories he grew up listening to, only to find that his idol is a world-weary warrior who went through hell to bring peace back to the world, and the actual battle wasn't nearly as triumphant as the stories would have you believe.
This is what it looks like when you've actually fought in battle. It's not glorious, it's not beautiful, it's merely doing what's right.
But again, they don't explore this any further than just scratching the surface in a single scene. It doesn't change the trajectory of the plot going forward, and it doesn't cause Soren to question his views of the Guardians, of the war, or anything like that. There's an echidna that appears in one scene to point the characters in the direction of their journey.
Now to reach the tree, keep between the whale's fin and the eye of Glocks.
And throughout the scene, I was constantly thinking to myself that this is like the only piece of like non-Sonic media that I've ever seen to have an echidna in it. And I think the fact that that's where my mind was says a lot about how invested I was in the plot.
Oh no!
There's one more character that I'd like to talk about, and that's Soren's older brother, Kludd. His storyline involves the two of them in a bit of a sibling rivalry at the beginning of the movie, with Kludd being kind of condescending towards Soren's fascination with the Guardians.
There's nothing wrong with dreams. Well, that's the difference between us, brother. I have mine when I'm asleep.
After they get captured, they're separated with Kludd sent to work as a soldier for the Pure Ones. This then leads to him feeling a sense of belonging and power that he never felt competing with Soren back home, leading to him eventually siding with the Pure Ones against Soren.
How could you join the Pure Ones after what they did to us? What they did to us? They believe in me like no one else ever has.
The problem is, this is a pretty extreme choice for a character to make, and I don't think the movie does enough to make it feel earned. Sure, Kludd was slightly antagonistic towards Soren, I guess, but I just don't feel like the movie does nearly enough to justify Kludd wanting to outright kill Soren. He doesn't even seem to show any remorse for siding with the people that are trying to hurt his family. He just seems to be happy to be in a position of power. And so when you get to that final battle where Soren and Kludd have to fight to the death, it doesn't feel like a tragic story of Soren having to sacrifice his own love for his brother for the good of the world. It feels more like Kludd is just an impressively petty asshole willing to conquer the entire world and murder his family members because of some minor disagreements back home. Hell, we don't even get to see much of Soren having to process what his brother's become, because for most of the movie, he's separated from him and doesn't realize it's even happening.
He's one of them.
He what? No, Egg. Look, you must be confused.
And speaking about that conflict, the action scenes in the movie are honestly pretty underwhelming. They're not very creative and mainly just involve the owls flying around and bumping into each other. And with the exception of some slow motion here and there isn't much of Snyder's usual style for directing action, which is a major shame, since love him or hate him, making action scenes is one of the main things I think we can all agree he's typically great at. The last point I want to touch on is one particular scene that occurs roughly 2/3 into the movie. The characters have found the Guardians, and after they convince them to help fight the Pure Ones, we get a training montage where the characters learn to become warriors. And that training montage is set to an original song made specifically for the movie titled To the Sky by Owl City.
Bird's eye view, awake the stars 'cause they're all around you.
Now, I really like Owl City's music, and I think that in a vacuum, this song is really good. It's upbeat and catchy, and it has a positive and optimistic vibe. The problem is, it's not really a good song for this movie. For most of the runtime, the movie is trying to be this sort of war-focused fantasy epic. And the film's original score leans into that with a sort of orchestral music that you might expect from this kind of story. I'm not saying that you can't deviate from that, but after doing that for most of the movie, having just one scene include this happy-go-lucky modern pop song just feels stunningly out of place. And it's so weird because, again, the choice of music is another thing that Zack Snyder usually excels at. Watchmen, for example, uses a lot of subdued rock and folk songs from artists like Bob Dylan, Simon and Garfunkel, and Jimi Hendrix to match the somewhat grounded and gritty story.
Come gather round, people, wherever you roam, within the sound of silence.
There must be some kind of way out of here.
Or to give a closer example from another good Snyder movie, look at Sucker Punch. That movie also... Get that look off your face. Yes, I said Sucker Punch was a good movie. What of it? Sucker Punch also has an extensive soundtrack of songs like Sweet Dreams Are Made of This by Eurythmics. The difference is that that movie understands that the dark and depressing tone it's going for isn't going to come across if the opening scene sounds like this.
Sweet dreams are made of this.
So instead, it adapts the song to be more appropriate for the scene by making a cover version. And these movies are working with pre-existing music that wasn't designed for the movies they appeared in. To the Sky is an original song that they had complete freedom to make sound however they wanted. I could be way off the mark here, but the song feels to me like it was included in the film because Well, first of all, because it's Owl City, but also because it's an animated film from the 2010s, so you gotta work in an up-tempo pop tune for the soundtrack. That's important. Because it sure as hell doesn't suit the story the movie is trying to tell. But who knows, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Zack Snyder's other movies would be better if they had Owl City. Let's try it.
From 10,000 lightning bugs. It's been fun, but now
It's a joke. It's all a joke.
And that encapsulates how I feel about this movie. While I can appreciate Zack Snyder's willingness to experiment outside of his comfort zone, it just ends up with a movie that feels generic and cliche. The characters, plot, and world building are just regurgitated pellets of things that I've seen in a million other movies like it, and there's not enough for it to be interesting in its own right. All it is just the basic building blocks of a fantasy adventure, but those blocks don't end up constructing anything. And all that leaves us with is a story that is, if you'll forgive the pun, light as a feather. At this point, all I can say is, God, I hope Rebel Moon ends up being good.
If you like this video, consider supporting me on Patreon. For just $1.50 a month, you'll get access to my videos before anyone else and a shout out from me at the end of every video. Thanks for watching.